A CEO who had everything, wealth, power, and an untouchable ego. He stood there mocking a poor street hawker, laughing at his honesty and humiliating him in front of everyone. But the moment he reached down and unzipped that old, tattered bag, his voice failed him, and his face turned ghostly pale. What was hidden inside that bag that brought a proud billionaire to his knees? Let's dive into today's chilling story of truth and consequence. The sun did not simply shine on the Sterling Empire building. It seemed to pay tribute to it. Standing at 80 stories of reinforced steel and tinted glass, the skyscraper was a monument to one man's relentless ambition, Arthur Sterling. Inside the penthouse office, the air was chilled to a precise 68 degrees, smelling faintly of expensive sandalwood and old money. Arthur Sterling sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of rare African ebony. At 45, he was the personification of success. His suit was bespoke, hand-stitched in London. His watch cost more than a suburban home, and his heart, many whispered, was made of the same cold flint as his building's foundation. To Arthur, the world was a chessboard, and every person he encountered was either a pawn to be moved or an obstacle to be crushed. He didn't believe in luck, and he certainly didn't believe in mercy. He believed in the Sterling standard: power, profit, and prestige. On this particular Tuesday, Arthur was in a foul mood. A multi-billion-dollar merger was stalling, and his patience was wearing thin. He buzzed his secretary. "Marcus, have the car brought around. I'm going to the club for lunch. I need to breathe air that hasn't been recycled by a ventilation system." Arthur descended in his private gold-leaf elevator, feeling the slight pressure in his ears as he dropped from the heavens of the elite to the chaos of the common man. His chauffeur, a quiet man named Elias, stood by the door of a charcoal-gray Rolls-Royce Phantom. As the car glided away from the curb, Arthur stared out the window. He hated the city at street level. It was too loud, too dirty, and far too crowded with people he considered background noise. To him, the thousands of commuters rushing by were nothing more than ants in a colony he happened to own. The traffic was unusually heavy. Construction on Fifth Avenue had diverted the flow into the narrower, grittier side streets of the old district. Arthur's fingers tapped rhythmically on his leather armrest. "Elias, why are we stopping?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. It seems there's a blockage ahead. A street vendor's cart has stalled in the middle of the intersection." Arthur's eyes darkened. "Fix it." Elias stepped out, but Arthur, fueled by a sudden surge of impatient rage, pushed his door open as well. The heat of the afternoon hit him like a physical blow, carrying the scent of roasted nuts, exhaust fumes, and sweat. In the middle of the narrow street stood a man who looked like he belonged to a different century. His name was Samuel. His skin was the color of parched earth, etched with deep lines that told a story of decades spent under the sun. He wore a faded flannel shirt, patched at the elbows, and trousers that had seen better days. His cart was a makeshift wooden structure on bicycle wheels, filled with handmade trinkets, old books, and small bags of lavender. Samuel was frantically trying to lift the left wheel of his cart, which had wedged itself into a deep, jagged pothole. A line of cars was already honking, the cacophony of the city rising in a fever pitch. Arthur marched toward the old man, his polished Oxfords clicking sharply on the asphalt. "You!" Arthur barked, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're holding up the entire city because of this pile of junk. Samuel looked up. His eyes were not filled with the fear Arthur expected. Instead, they were calm, a deep, observant brown. "I am truly sorry, sir," Samuel said, his voice raspy but steady. "The wheel is stuck. If I can just get a bit of leverage." "I don't care about your leverage," Arthur spat. "I have a meeting at the Metropolitan. My time is worth $10,000 a minute. Your entire existence isn't worth a minute of my time. Move this trash, or I'll have the police bulldoze it into the river." A small crowd had begun to gather, watching the billionaire berate the beggar. Samuel took a breath and stood up straight, despite his aching back. "Sir, I am moving as fast as an old man can. We all have places to be, but some of us carry heavier burdens than others." Arthur sneered, his lip curling in disgust. He noticed a small, tattered canvas bag tucked under the seat of the cart. It was stained with grease and dust, tied shut with a piece of frayed twine. "Is that where you keep your treasures?" Arthur mocked, pointing a manicured finger at the bag. "What's in there? Spare change, scraps of food you begged for, or maybe your dignity?" Samuel's hand instinctively went to the bag, shielding it. "In this bag, sir, is something you wouldn't understand. It is the weight of an honest life. It is the only thing I have left that hasn't been taken by the world." Arthur let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "Honesty? Honesty is a fairy tale told by losers to justify why they're poor. You're not honest, you're just unsuccessful. If you were smart, you'd be sitting in the back of that Rolls Royce instead of dragging a wooden box through the dirt." The CEO took a step closer, his shadow looming over the old man. "You think your honesty makes you better than me? I built an empire, I created jobs, I shaped the skyline. And what have you done? You've blocked traffic." The tension was palpable. The air felt thick, charged with the electricity of a storm about to break. Arthur, driven by a cruel impulse to humiliate the man further, reached out. "Let's see what honesty looks like," Arthur hissed. Samuel tried to pull the bag away. "Please, sir, this is private. It has nothing to do with you." "Everything in this city has to do with me," Arthur yelled. He shoved the old man aside with a strength born of pure arrogance. Samuel stumbled, falling against his cart as the crowd gasped. Arthur grabbed the tattered bag. It was surprisingly heavy, feeling like it contained a solid, singular weight. The twine was knotted tightly. Arthur didn't bother untying it. He pulled a small, silver pocket knife from his suit and sliced through the string with a vicious flick. "Look at this, everyone," Arthur shouted to the onlookers, holding the bag up like a trophy. "The great hawker's secret. Let's see the honesty he's so proud of." He reached in and pulled the mouth of the bag wide. The transition was instantaneous. The mocking smile on Arthur's face didn't just fade. It vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer, paralyzing shock. His breath hitched in his throat. The noise of the city, the honking, the shouting, the whispering, seemed to be sucked into a vacuum of silence. Arthur's hands began to tremble. His knees, which had stood firm in the face of hostile takeovers and economic crashes, suddenly felt like water. Inside the bag, nestled in a bed of old velvet, was not money. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a scab of food. It was a heavy, gold-encased locket, and next to it, a folded, yellowed photograph. But it wasn't the value of the gold that broke Arthur. It was the face in the photograph. It was a face he hadn't seen in 25 years, a face that haunted his dreams, a face that represented the only time Arthur Sterling had ever been a poor boy with a heart. The CEO's grip loosened. The bag slipped from his fingers, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. He looked at Samuel, but he didn't see a hawker anymore. He saw a ghost. "Where?" Arthur's voice was a broken whisper, the sterling standard crumbling into dust. "Where did you get this?" Samuel stood up slowly, wiping the dust from his worn trousers. He didn't look angry. He looked sad. "I told you, sir," Samuel said quietly. "You wouldn't understand the weight of it, not until you saw it for yourself." The crowd watched in confusion as the most powerful man in the city slumped against the side of his $1 million car, his face as white as a shroud, staring at a tattered bag in the middle of a dirty street. The bustling intersection of Fifth and Main had become a vacuum. The honking of taxis, the distant siren of an ambulance, and the chatter of the gathering crowd seemed to mute into a low, underwater hum. Arthur Sterling, the man who owned the skyline, was no longer looking at a beggar. He was looking at a ghost. The photograph that had slipped slightly out of the velvet lining of the gold locket was black and white, its edges frayed and yellowed by decades of humidity and touch. It showed a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, leaning against a wooden fence. She had a smile that seemed to defy the gravity of her poverty, a smile that Arthur had buried under layers of cold hard cash and corporate steel. "Her name was Alina," Arthur whispered, though the words barely left his lips. His expensive leather shoes were now inches away from the grime of the gutter, but he didn't care. The sterling standard had vanished. 25 years ago, Arthur Sterling didn't have a bespoke suit or a charcoal gray Rolls-Royce. He was a runaway with nothing but a hunger for power and a heart that hadn't yet turned to stone. He had ended up in a small, dusty town 3 states away, working at a local mill for pennies. That was where he met Alina. She was the daughter of a local carpenter, a girl who saw the world not as a series of transactions, but as a collection of moments. Arthur had loved her with the desperation of a man who had nothing else. They had made a pact. Arthur would go to the city, build a life, and come back for her. But the city changed him. The first $1 million acted like a drug, numbing the part of his brain that remembered the smell of pine trees and Alina's laughter. When he finally had the power to go back, he chose not to. He didn't want a small-town girl holding back his ascent to the global stage. He had sent a letter, cold, brief, and accompanied by a check, telling her to move on. He never heard from her again. He assumed she had taken the money and found a local man to grow old with. Arthur reached down, his fingers trembling as he picked up the gold locket from the pavement. It was heavy, solid 24-karat gold, an anomaly in the hands of a street hawker. On the back of the locket, engraved in elegant, faded script, were the initials, AS to EM. "I bought this," Arthur stammered, looking up at Samuel. "I bought this with my first real paycheck. I sent it to her, with the letter." Samuel stood there, his posture no longer slumped. He looked at Arthur not with the eyes of a victim, but with the eyes of a judge. "She never cashed the check, Mr. Sterling, but she kept the locket. She said it was a reminder that even the brightest gold can hide a heart of lead." The crowd was leaning in now, sensing the shift. The mighty CEO was unraveling in public. Elias, the chauffeur, took a step forward to intervene, but Arthur waved him back with a weak, shaking hand. "How do you have this?" Arthur demanded, his voice regaining a fraction of its steel, fueled by a defensive spark of suspicion. Did you steal this from her? Did you find it in the trash, a man like you? There is no way you knew Alina. Samuel took a slow step toward Arthur. He didn't flinch at the billionaire's tone. I didn't steal it, Arthur. I inherited it, along with the debt of her medical bills and the cost of a headstone that took me 10 years to pay off. The words hit Arthur like a physical blow to the chest. Medical bills, headstone. She's gone, Arthur's voice broke. She passed away 15 years ago, Samuel said softly, in a small apartment above a bakery. She spent her life teaching children how to read, living on almost nothing. She never spoke ill of you, even when the winter got cold and the heaters didn't work. She just said that you were a man who had lost his way before he ever found his destination. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. He looked at the tattered bag again. There was something else inside, a smaller, leather-bound journal. "And who are you?" Arthur asked, his eyes searching Samuel's face, looking for a resemblance, a clue. Samuel smiled, but it was a sad, tired smile. "I was the man who stayed. I was the neighbor who brought her soup when she was too weak to cook. I was the friend who held her hand when she breathed her last. And I am the man who promised her that one day, if I ever saw the man in that photograph, I would give him back his honesty." Arthur looked down at the bag. He realized now why Samuel had called it the weight of an honest life. Inside that bag wasn't just a locket and a photo. It was the physical evidence of everything Arthur had traded away for his billions. It was the ghost of the man he used to be. The CEO looked at his Rolls-Royce. It looked like a tomb. He looked at his reflection in the tinted glass, the sharp jawline, the expensive haircut, the eyes that looked like cold glass. He realized he didn't recognize himself. "You've been carrying this all this time?" Arthur asked. "I've been looking for you for 5 years, Mr. Sterling," Samuel replied. "Not to ask for money, not to beg. I sell these trinkets to keep my belly full, but I kept this bag for a different reason. I wanted to see if the man who built the Sterling Empire was worth the tears Alina shed for him." Samuel reached out and took the bag back from Arthur's weakened grip. He zipped it up with a slow, deliberate motion. "The bag is open now, Arthur," Samuel said, using the CEO's first name for the first time. "And you have gone silent. Is your power helping you now? Is your $10,000 a minute time fixing the hole in your soul?" The onlookers were silent. The cars behind the Rolls-Royce had stopped honking. There was a profound sense of gravity in the air. Arthur Sterling, the man who mocked the poor hawker, was now standing in the middle of a dirty street, his ego shattered, facing a man who possessed the only thing Arthur truly wanted, a clear conscience. Arthur looked at the crowd, then back at Samuel. He felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to hide back in his golden tower, to drown this feeling in gin and spreadsheets. But he couldn't move. The bag was closed, but the secrets were out. "I can help you," Arthur said, his hand reaching for his wallet in a desperate, habitual gesture. "I can give you a house, a pension. I can make this right." Samuel looked at the wallet as if it were a piece of diseased meat. "You still don't get it, do you? You think everything has a price. You think you can buy back 25 years of silence with a signature on a check." Samuel turned back to his cart. With a heave of his thin shoulders, he pushed the wooden frame. The wheel, which had been stuck in the pothole, suddenly gave way with a loud crack, freeing itself. "I don't want your money, Arthur," Samuel said over his shoulder as he began to wheel the cart away. "I just wanted you to see what was in the bag." Arthur Sterling stood paralyzed as the wooden cart creaked further away, the rhythm of its wobbling wheels sounding like a ticking clock in the silence of the street. For the first time in his adult life, Arthur didn't have a plan. He didn't have a legal team to draft a rebuttal or a PR firm to spin the narrative. He was just a man in an expensive suit, standing in a puddle of dirty rainwater, watching his past walk away. "Mr. Sterling, sir, we really must go. The police are clearing the lane," Elias, the chauffeur, whispered, his voice laced with uncharacteristic pity. Arthur didn't answer. He looked at his hand, the same hand that had signed billion-dollar deals, and saw it was still shaking. The cold metal of the gold locket had left an imprint on his palm, a physical mark of a ghost. "Elias," Arthur said, his voice sounding hollow as if it were coming from the bottom of a well. "Go back to the office. Tell the board I've been taken ill. Cancel the merger meeting. Cancel everything." "But sir, the shareholders." "I don't care about the shareholders," Arthur roared, the sudden explosion of his old temper startling the few remaining onlookers. He immediately softened, his shoulders dropping. "Just go, Elias, I need to walk." Without waiting for a response, Arthur turned and began to follow the distant, hunched figure of Samuel. He left the charcoal-gray Rolls-Royce behind like a discarded shell. As Arthur followed Samuel, the scenery began to change. The gleaming glass towers of the financial district gave way to red brick tenements and rusted fire escapes. The air grew thicker with the smell of frying oil and damp concrete. This was the part of the city Arthur usually only saw from the window of a helicopter, a gray, sprawling blur that he considered a necessary inefficiency. Samuel moved with a surprising pace for a man of his age, navigating the maze of alleyways with the ease of a ghost. Arthur, however, struggled. His stiff leather shoes were not meant for cracked pavement and oily cobblestones. By the time they reached a narrow street lined with shuttered warehouses and flickering neon signs, Arthur was out of breath, his tie loosened, and his pride further dampened by the stares of the locals. Finally, Samuel stopped in front of a heavy iron door beneath a crumbling stone archway. He didn't turn around, even though he clearly knew Arthur had been shadowing him for the last 2 miles. "The air is different down here, isn't it, Arthur?" Samuel said, his back still turned. "It doesn't smell like air conditioning and ambition. It smells like reality." Samuel pushed the door open, beckoning Arthur inside. It wasn't a house. It was a makeshift workshop filled with the skeletons of old furniture, stacks of yellowed books, and the same lavender scent that had clung to Samuel's cart. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. In the corner, on a small wooden table, sat a framed photograph of Alina, the same one from the locket, but larger, clearer. Next to it was a small candle, unlit. Arthur walked toward the photo, his heart hammering against his ribs. Up close, he could see the details he had forgotten. The small mole near her left eye, the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear. "She waited," Samuel said, sitting on a crate and beginning to unpack the tattered bag. "For 3 years after you left, she walked to the post office every single Saturday. She thought the city had swallowed your letters or that you were hurt. She never once thought you had simply forgotten her. Arthur felt a lump in his throat that felt like a stone. I didn't forget her, Samuel. I chose a different life. I thought she would do the same. Choosing a life is one thing, Samuel replied, his voice devoid of anger, replaced by a devastating calmness. But you didn't just choose a life. You sent her that locket and that letter as a bribe for her silence. You wanted to buy your way out of the guilt. But Alina didn't want the gold. She wanted the man who promised to build a life with her, not away from her. Samuel reached into the bag and pulled out the leather-bound journal Arthur had glimpsed earlier. He tossed it onto the table. This was her journal. She wrote in it every day until her hands became too shaky to hold the pen. Go ahead, Arthur. Read the sterling standard from the perspective of the woman you left behind. Arthur hesitated. He was a man who lived by data, by facts, by bottom lines. But as he opened the journal, he realized he was about to read the only audit that actually mattered. The first few pages were filled with hope, plans for their future, sketches of a house they would never own. But as the pages turned, the ink seemed to grow darker, the handwriting more frantic. Oct 14th, no letter today. Perhaps the winter storms have delayed the mail. Arthur is strong, he will find a way to write. Jan 22nd, the locket arrived today. It is beautiful and it feels like a weight. The letter, the words were his, but the voice was a stranger's. He sent money. Does he think I am a debt to be settled? Arthur turned the pages, his eyes blurring. He read about her struggle with the illness, a slow, draining fever that took her strength but never her spirit. He read about how she used the money he sent to build a small library for the neighborhood children because she didn't want his cold gold in her house. She spent every penny of your settlement on others, Samuel whispered. She lived in poverty so that the children in this slum could have books. She died in this very district, in a room no bigger than your walk-in closet, surrounded by the only thing she truly valued, her honesty. Arthur closed the journal. The silence in the workshop was heavy, suffocating. He looked at his hands, the hands of a billionaire, and felt an overwhelming sense of poverty. He was the one who had nothing. He had the towers, the cars, and the bank accounts, but he was standing in a room with a street hawker, and he felt like a beggar. Why are you telling me this now? Arthur asked, his voice cracking. Why wait 15 years after she died to find me? Samuel stood up and walked to the single window, looking out at the sunset hitting the tops of the skyscrapers in the distance, Arthur's towers. Because for 15 years, I watched you grow colder. I watched your face on the news, becoming more like a statue and less like a human. I waited until you reached the very top, Arthur. I waited until you thought you were invincible. Samuel turned back to him, his eyes piercing. I wanted to show you the bag when you had the most to lose, because truth is like medicine. It only works when the patient realizes they are dying. And looking at you now, I think you finally realize that the Sterling Empire is built on a graveyard of broken promises. Arthur looked at the locket on the table. He reached out and touched the cold gold. He realized that the mocking he had done on the street wasn't just an act of arrogance. It was a subconscious defense mechanism. He had spent 25 years mocking the poor because he was terrified of the truth they carried. What do you want me to do? Arthur asked, a genuine plea for guidance. Samuel picked up the locket and placed it back into Arthur's hand. I don't want anything from you, Arthur. Samuel the hawker has everything he needs, but Arthur the king, he has a lot of work to do. You can't bring her back. You can't fix 25 years of silence, but you can decide what the next 25 years look like. Samuel walked to the door and opened it, the cool evening air rushing in. Now leave, go back to your tower, but remember, every time you look at that skyline, remember the bag, remember the weight of an honest life. Arthur walked out into the night, the gold locket clenched so tightly in his fist that it drew blood. He didn't call for a car. He didn't look for a taxi. He started walking, not toward the financial district, but toward the heart of the city he had ignored for so long. The lobby of the Sterling Empire building was a cathedral of limestone and silence. Usually, when Arthur Sterling entered, the atmosphere tightened. Security guards straightened their ties, and receptionists lowered their voices. But tonight, as Arthur pushed through the heavy revolving doors, the silence was born of confusion. Arthur was unrecognizable. His bespoke suit was wrinkled and stained with the grime of the lower districts. His hair, usually slicked back into a sharp blade of silver, was disheveled. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled his staff. They were no longer the predatory blue of a shark, but the hollow, aching gray of a man who had seen his own funeral. He ignored the greetings. He ignored the frantic approach of his chief operating officer, a man named Henderson, who had been waiting for 3 hours. "Arthur, thank God," Henderson stammered, scurrying to keep up with Arthur's long, erratic strides toward the private elevator. "The board is in a panic. The merger with the Tanaka Group is on the verge of collapse because you went AWOL. Where have you been? And why? Why do you look like you've been in a street fight?" Arthur reached the elevator and pressed the button. He looked at Henderson, a man he had known for 15 years, and felt as if he were looking at a stranger. "I was in a fight, Henderson," Arthur said, his voice sandpaper rough, "but not the kind you're used to." The elevator climbed 80 floors in a matter of seconds, but to Arthur, it felt like an eternity. He looked at his reflection in the gold leaf doors. He looked at the locket he still gripped in his hand. He realized that this elevator, this building, this entire empire was a fortress built to keep people like Samuel and memories like Alina out. He stepped into his office. The sandalwood scent now felt suffocating, like the smell of a funeral parlor. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city. From here, the streets where Samuel pushed his cart were invisible. The poverty, the struggle, the weight of an honest life were all hidden by the curve of the earth and the glare of the lights. "It's a lie," Arthur whispered to the glass. "Excuse me." Henderson had followed him in, his iPad held like a shield. "Arthur, we have 30 minutes to get you cleaned up. The Tanaka representatives are on the line. They need your signature on the bridge loan agreement. If we don't sign tonight, we lose the lead position in the Asian market." Arthur turned around. He walked to his ebony desk, the desk carved from a single slab of rare wood, and sat down. He didn't look at the iPad. He looked at the gold locket, which he placed precisely in the center of the desk. "Tell them the merger is off," Arthur said. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt as if the building itself were leaning. Henderson's jaw dropped. "Off, Arthur, that's $40 billion in market cap. You're joking. This is stress talking. Let me call your doctor." "The merger is off, Henderson, and I want the Sterling Foundation's charter brought to me, immediately." The foundation. We only use that for tax write-offs and the annual gala. Why? Because we are going to actually use it, Arthur snapped, a flash of his old fire returning, but directed at a new target. I want a full audit of our holdings in the lower districts. Every warehouse, every dilapidated tenement we've bought and let rot while we wait for the land value to rise. I want them converted. Converted into what? Housing, schools, libraries, Arthur said, his mind flashing to Alina's journal. And I want it started by Monday. Henderson retreated a step, his face pale. Arthur, you're talking about liquidating billions in real estate assets. The board will remove you. They'll claim you've had a mental breakdown. You can't just dismantle the empire because you had a bad afternoon. Arthur stood up, leaning over the desk. I didn't have a bad afternoon. I had a wake-up call that lasted 25 years. This empire isn't a success, Henderson, it's a debt, and I've just seen the bill. Henderson left the room, his footsteps frantic as he went to call the lawyers and the other board members. Arthur was alone again. He picked up the locket and opened it. The small photo of Alina looked up at him. In the harsh, artificial LED lighting of the office, the black-and-white image seemed more real than anything else in the room. He remembered the hawker's words. I wanted to show you the bag when you had the most to lose. Samuel was right. Arthur had everything to lose, his reputation, his fortune, his standing in the world. But for the first time, the thought of losing those things didn't terrify him. It felt like shedding a suit of armor that had become too heavy to wear. He sat back and opened the leather-bound journal Samuel had given him. He turned to a page near the middle, dated 10 years ago. Today, a boy asked me why I live here if I have a gold locket, Alina had written. I told him that gold doesn't keep you warm and it doesn't tell you the truth. Only people can do that. I hope the man who gave it to me finds a person who tells him the truth one day. Arthur closed his eyes. He realized that Samuel was that person. Samuel hadn't come to him for money because Samuel knew that money was the very thing that had blinded Arthur. He had come to give Arthur the only thing he lacked, a mirror. A soft knock came at the door. It wasn't Henderson. It was Elias, the chauffeur. He was still in his uniform, but he wasn't holding a car key. He was holding a small, brown paper bag. I thought you might be hungry, sir, Elias said quietly. You didn't eat lunch. Arthur looked at his driver. He realized he didn't even know if Elias had a family. He didn't know where Elias lived. Thank you, Elias. Sit down. Elias looked surprised, but sat in one of the expensive leather chairs. The building is buzzing, sir. They say you've canceled the Tanaka deal. I have, Arthur said. He pushed the paper bag across the desk and opened it. It was a simple sandwich from a street deli. The smell was sharp and real. Elias, how long have you worked for me? 12 years, sir. And in those 12 years, have I ever asked you about your life? Elias looked down at his hands. No, sir, but that wasn't the job. It should have been, Arthur said. He looked at the gold locket, then at the sandwich, then at the multi-million-dollar view of the city. Tomorrow, I'm going to go back to that street. I'm going to find that hawker. I don't think he'll be there, sir, Elias said. Men like that, they move with the wind. Then I'll find the wind, Arthur replied. As the moon rose over the Sterling Empire building, the lights in the penthouse stayed on. Outside, the world was preparing for a corporate war. The board was already meeting in secret, preparing to oust their king. But inside, Arthur Sterling wasn't thinking about stocks or dividends. He was reading a journal, learning about a woman he had killed with his silence, and a man who had saved him with a bag of junk. The real black story was just beginning. It wasn't a story of how a man got rich, but how a rich man finally realized he was a pauper. By 9:00 a.m. the following morning, the Sterling Empire building was no longer a monument to Arthur's success. It was a fortress under siege. News of the canceled Tanaka merger had leaked, and the company's stock had plummeted 12% in pre-market trading. The air in the executive corridors felt static, charged with the frantic energy of lawyers and shareholders who smelled blood in the water. Arthur sat in the small, windowless dressing room attached to his office. He looked at the charcoal suit laid out for him, the battle armor of the corporate elite. For 25 years, putting on this suit had made him feel invincible. Today, it felt like a costume. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold locket. He held it for a moment, the cool metal a stark contrast to the boiling chaos outside his door. He wasn't going to wear the suit. Instead, he pulled on a simple black sweater and dark trousers, clothes that wouldn't stand out in a crowd, clothes that felt human. The main boardroom was a cathedral of glass and mahogany. The 14 members of the board were already seated, their faces grim, lit by the blue glow of their laptop screens. At the head of the table sat Genevieve Vance, the oldest member of the board and a woman who had been Arthur's mentor, and eventually his coldest rival. As Arthur walked in, the whispering stopped. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He pulled up a chair on the side, amongst the junior observers. "Arthur," Genevieve began, her voice like cracking ice. "We've spent the last 6 hours reviewing your directives from last night. The cancellation of the Tanaka merger, the liquidation of the district holdings. These are not the actions of a rational CEO. We've had calls from the SEC, from London, from Tokyo. They want to know if you've had a stroke." Arthur leaned back, his hands folded in his lap. "I haven't had a stroke, Genevieve. I've had a recovery. I've recovered my sight." "Sight?" a younger board member scoffed. "You've wiped $4 billion off our valuation in 12 hours. We are here to discuss your immediate resignation and the appointment of an interim lead. We have the votes, Arthur. Don't make this a public spectacle." Arthur looked around the table. He saw men and women he had grown rich with. He saw people who had attended his galas and laughed at his jokes, yet none of them were looking at him as a person. They were looking at a malfunctioning machine that was costing them money. 25 years ago, Arthur began, his voice calm and melodic, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "I left a woman named Alina in a small town with nothing but a promise. I built this company to prove that I was better than the poverty I came from. I thought every floor we added to this building was a step away from the shame of being poor." "We aren't here for a biography, Arthur," Genevieve interrupted. "You're here for the truth," Arthur fired back, his voice rising. "I spent yesterday with a man who carries everything he owns in a wooden cart. He showed me a bag. Inside that bag was a locket I gave to Alina 25 years ago. She lived in the very slums we are currently holding for investment. She died there because she wouldn't use my blood money to save herself. She spent it on the community instead." He stood up and walked to the head of the table, placing the gold locket on the mahogany surface. This board thinks value is measured in ticker symbols, but I've realized that our holdings in the lower districts are currently housing the people we are crushing under the weight of our success. I am not resigning. I am pivoting. The Sterling Empire is going to become the Sterling Trust. We are going to rebuild those districts, not for profit, but for the debt we owe the people who live there. The room erupted. 3 members started shouting at once. Genevieve Vance simply stared at the locket, her eyes narrowing. "You're insane," she whispered. "The shareholders will sue us into the ground. You have a fiduciary duty to maximize profit, not to play the guilt-ridden philanthropist because of a dead girlfriend." Arthur looked at her. Her name was Alina, and it's not guilt, Genevieve. It's math. If we continue to hollow out this city, eventually there will be nothing left for us to own but a graveyard. I'm saving this company by giving it a purpose. "You don't have the power anymore," Genevieve said, standing up. She signaled to the legal counsel. "By the bylaws of this corporation, under Section 14B, the board is declaring you unfit for duty. Security is already on their way to escort you from the building. Your access to all accounts and properties is being frozen as we speak." Arthur didn't flinch. He expected this. He looked at Henderson, his COO, who was sitting at the far end of the table, looking at the floor. "Henderson," Arthur said, "you were with me when we bought the first block in the old district. You remember what it looked like before we boarded it up. Are you going to sit there and watch them kill the only good thing I've tried to do in a decade?" Henderson looked up, his eyes darting between Arthur and Genevieve. The silence lasted 10 seconds, but it felt like a century. Finally, Henderson stood up. "I'm not a brave man, Arthur," Henderson said, his voice trembling. "But I've seen the reports. We've been keeping those buildings empty on purpose to drive up the neighborhood prices. It's always bothered me. I won't vote to remove you." 2 other board members, the younger ones who hadn't yet been completely hardened by the Sterling standard, looked at each other and slowly stood up. The vote was tied. The boardroom became a stalemate. Genevieve Vance looked like she wanted to strike Arthur physically. "Fine," she spat. "The tie keeps you in the seat for now, but we will take this to the shareholders meeting next month. You'll be out by then and you'll leave with nothing. No severance, no stock options, no legacy. You'll be just like that hawker you're so fond of." Arthur picked up the locket from the table. "Genevieve, I've spent my whole life terrified of being like that hawker, but standing here, looking at you, I realize that he is the only free man I've met in 20 years. Arthur walked out of the boardroom. He didn't go to his office. He didn't go to the elevator. He took the stairs. By the time Arthur reached the ground floor, he was sweating, his heart pounding from the physical exertion. He pushed through the lobby, ignoring the cameras and the reporters who had gathered like vultures. He needed to find Samuel. He needed to tell him that he had started the work. He needed to know if the weight of an honest life could ever be shared. He walked back to the intersection where it had all started. The pothole was still there, but the street was empty. No Rolls-Royce, no crowd, and no wooden cart. He searched the side alleys, his eyes scanning every shadow, every hunched figure. He walked for hours, deeper into the district where Samuel's workshop was located. But when he reached the iron door under the stone archway, his heart sank. The iron door was wide open. The workshop was empty. The skeletons of furniture, the stacks of books, and the photograph of Alina, everything was gone. Only the faint, fatting scent of lavender remained in the air. On the crate where Samuel had sat, there was a small piece of yellowed paper, held down by a smooth river stone. Arthur picked it up. "The bag is yours now, Arthur," the note read in cramped, elegant handwriting. "I have carried it long enough. Don't look for me. Look for the people Alina loved. That is where you will find your honesty. The wheel is no longer stuck. Keep moving." Arthur stood in the empty workshop, the note in his hand. He realized that Samuel hadn't just been a messenger, he had been a catalyst. He had waited for the perfect moment to hand over the burden of the past so that he could finally find his own peace. Arthur looked out the window at the skyline. His building, the Sterling Empire, was visible in the distance, glowing gold in the afternoon sun. It looked different now. It didn't look like a throne. It looked like a responsibility. He pulled out his phone. He didn't call the board. He didn't call the lawyers. "Elias," Arthur said when the driver picked up, "I need you to bring the car, not the rolls. Bring the old van we used for the charity deliveries 3 years ago. And Elias, bring a hammer and some nails. We have some work to do on a warehouse on 4th Street. The CEO of the Sterling Empire sat on a dusty crate in a forgotten workshop and smiled. The real black story of Arthur Sterling was no longer a tragedy. It was a transformation. The transition from a climate-controlled penthouse to the damp, rat-infested corridors of the old district warehouses was not just a change in scenery. It was a sensory assault. Arthur Sterling, a man who once refused to walk on a carpet that hadn't been steam-cleaned daily, was now standing knee-deep in sawdust and debris. It had been 2 weeks since the boardroom coup. Arthur remained the CEO in name, but his power was being eroded daily by legal injunctions and board-led sabotage. He didn't care. He had diverted a massive chunk of his personal liquid assets, money the board couldn't touch, into a new project, the Alina Memorial Housing Trust. He had started with the very warehouse where Samuel's workshop had been. He bought the entire block. But as Arthur stood there holding a blueprint, he realized that a vision was easy. The reality was a war. "Sir, the plumbing in the south wing isn't just old. It's non-existent," Elias said, wiping grease from his forehead. The chauffeur had traded his cap for a hard hat and his polished shoes for work boots. He had stayed by Arthur's side, becoming the only bridge between Arthur's old life and this new, chaotic mission. "Then we replace it, Elias. Every pipe. Every wire," Arthur replied, his voice firm but tired. "With what money, Arthur?" The voice came from the shadows of the warehouse entrance. Arthur turned to see Genevieve Vance standing there, flanked by 2 men in expensive, dark suits. She looked at the peeling paint and the stacks of lumber with a mixture of pity and disgust. "The court granted the preliminary injunction this morning," Genevieve said, stepping over a pile of bricks with practiced grace. "Your personal accounts have been flagged as subject to corporate clawback. They're arguing that the money you're spending on this charity project was gained through insider knowledge before you sabotaged the Tanaka deal." Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty building. "You're freezing my personal funds. I earned that money over 20 years. "You earned it under the Sterling name," Genevieve countered. "And as long as you are using it to dismantle Sterling assets, the board has a right to protect the shareholders. You're broke, Arthur. or you will be by Friday. Stop this madness. Sign the resignation, walk away with your dignity, and we might drop the lawsuit. Arthur looked at the workers he had hired, local men and women from the neighborhood who finally had a job that wasn't cleaning up after the rich. He looked at the blueprints for the library he wanted to build, the one Alina had dreamed of in her journal. You can take the money, Genevieve, Arthur said, walking toward her until he was inches away. You can take the cars and the penthouse, but you can't take the land. I transferred the titles to a nonprofit trust yesterday morning. The land belongs to the community now. You want it. You'll have to sue 500 poor families to get it back. Imagine the PR on that. Genevieve's face tightened. The mask of corporate cool cracked for a second. You think you're a saint, Arthur? You're just a man playing God in a graveyard. These people don't want a library. They want to survive. And you've just made them targets. She turned and left, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete. Genevieve's warning wasn't empty. By nightfall, the atmosphere in the district changed. Arthur decided to sleep in the back of the warehouse on a cot, refusing to return to the empty luxury of his apartment. Around 2:00 a.m., he was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. He rushed to the front of the warehouse to find a small fire burning near the lumber stacks. A group of 4 men, their faces obscured by hoodies, were standing by the perimeter fence. They weren't corporate lawyers. They were the local muscle, a gang known as the Vultures, who had long controlled the illegal trade in the abandoned buildings Arthur was now trying to fix. "Hey!" Arthur shouted, grabbing a heavy flashlight. One of the men stepped forward. He was young, his eyes hard and hollow. "You the big man from the tower." "I own this building," Arthur said, trying to summon the authority that usually made subordinates tremble. The young man laughed, a dry, jagged sound. "You don't own nothing down here. This block was ours long before you showed up with your fancy plans. You're driving up the heat. Police moving in, inspectors sniffing around. You're messing with our business." "I'm building homes," Arthur argued. "I'm building a place for your families to live without fear." "We don't need homes from you," the man spat. "We need you to leave. Consider this your first and only warning. The next fire won't be in the lumber. It'll be in your cot." They vanished into the darkness before Arthur could say another word. Arthur sat on the floor of the warehouse, watching the small fire die out. For the first time, he felt the true weight of the bag Samuel had given him. Honesty wasn't just about telling the truth. It was about standing your ground when the truth made you a target. He realized he had been naive. He thought his money and his good intentions would act as a shield. He thought the world would simply step aside because he had decided to be a good man. But the world doesn't work that way. The world is a complex web of power, and when you pull on one string, the whole web vibrates. By trying to save the district, he was threatening the people who profited from its decay, both the corporate vultures like Genevieve and the street vultures like the gang. The next morning, Elias found Arthur sitting by the charred lumber, staring at the gold locket. "They came last night, didn't they?" Elias asked, setting down a thermos of coffee. "They did," Arthur said. "They told me I don't own this place. And they're right, Elias, I don't. I spent 20 years thinking ownership was a piece of paper signed in a lawyer's office. But down here, ownership is earned with blood and presence." "What are we going to do, sir? The workers are scared. Half of them didn't show up this morning. They heard the vultures were looking for blood." Arthur stood up. He looked at the tattered bag Samuel had left behind, which now sat on the workbench. He reached inside and pulled out Alina's journal. He turned to the very last entry, written only days before she died. "I am not afraid of the dark," she had written, "because the dark is only the absence of people who are willing to hold a light. If you want to change a place, you have to become part of its soil." Arthur looked at Elias. "We're not going to hire security, Elias, and we're not going to call the police." "Then what?" "We're going to invite them in," Arthur said, a strange, calm light in his eyes. "The vultures, the neighbors, the shopkeepers, everyone. We're going to have a meeting in the middle of the street. If I'm going to be part of this soil, I'd better start introducing myself." That evening, under a gray, drizzling sky, Arthur Sterling stood in the middle of the intersection where he had first mocked Samuel. He didn't have a microphone or a stage. He just had his voice. Slowly, doors began to open. The invisible people of the district, the ones Arthur used to look over, began to emerge. They stood in the rain, their arms crossed, their expressions suspicious. Among them were the vultures, lurking at the edge of the crowd, their hands in their pockets. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he shouted, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "Most of you know me as the man who owns the building that blocked your son. You know me as the man who wanted to tear your homes down for a profit." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I'm not that man anymore," Arthur continued, holding up the gold locket so the streetlights caught its glint. "This locket belonged to a woman named Alina. She lived here. She died here. She was better than me in every way that matters. I'm here to finish the work she started. I'm not building for you, I'm building with you." He looked directly at the leader of the vultures. "You want me to leave because I'm messing with your business. My business is making sure your younger brothers and sisters don't end up with a bullet in their chest or a needle in their arm. If you want to burn this place down, go ahead. But you'll have to burn me with it because I'm not going back to my tower." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain. The leader of the vultures stepped forward, his eyes searching Arthur's. He saw the grime under Arthur's fingernails. He saw the exhaustion in his face. He saw that the king was bleeding, just like everyone else. The young man didn't say a word. He just nodded once and walked away, his crew following him. It wasn't an alliance, but it was a truce. As the crowd began to disperse, an old woman walked up to Arthur. She reached out and touched the sleeve of his black sweater. "She was a good teacher," the woman whispered. "Alina, she taught my grandson to read when no one else would. If you're doing this for her, then I have some old tools in my basement you can use." Arthur felt a warmth in his chest that no amount of money had ever provided. He realized that Samuel hadn't just given him a bag of secrets. He had given him a key to a world he had been too rich to see. He looked up at the Sterling Empire building in the distance. For the first time, it didn't look so big. The atmospheric shift in the district was palpable. Where there had once been a heavy, suffocating silence of abandonment, there was now the rhythmic sound of hammers, the rasp of saws, and the low hum of a community awakening. But while the physical buildings were being mended, the legal walls were closing in on Arthur Sterling. Arthur was living in the warehouse full-time now. He had traded his silk sheets for a sleeping bag and his 5-course meals for street-side lentils. He looked thinner, his face weathered by dust and stress, but his eyes had never been clearer. "Arthur, you need to see this," Elias said, handing him a tablet. The screen showed a breaking news headline. "Sterling Board files for sanity hearing. CEO Arthur Sterling accused of squandering billions on mental breakdown." "They're not just trying to take the company anymore, Elias," Arthur said, rubbing his tired eyes. "They're trying to take my agency. If they prove I'm mentally unfit, every contract I've signed, including the land trust for this neighborhood, will be nullified. The bulldozers will be here by Monday." An hour later, a black sedan pulled up. Not a Rolls-Royce, but a government vehicle. Out stepped a man Arthur knew well, Senator Benjamin Crane, a man whose political career had been funded by sterling donations for a decade. "Arthur," the senator said, walking into the dusty warehouse, "you look terrible." "I feel honest, Ben. It's an exhausting combination," Arthur replied, not looking up from a plumbing joint he was trying to seal. "The board has a proposal. It's the final one. They'll drop the sanity hearing. They'll even give you a generous settlement. All you have to do is dissolve the trust and sign the district back over to the city's redevelopment authority, which, as you know, is chaired by Genevieve's cousin." Arthur stood up, his knees popping. "And if I don't?" "Then they'll destroy you. Not just your money, Arthur. They'll put you in a facility for evaluation. They'll make sure you never see the sun without a guard again. Is this worth it? These people. They'll forget you in a month. They'll take your housing and then sell it to the highest bidder the moment you're gone." Arthur looked at the locket, which was now hanging from a simple leather cord around his neck. "Samuel didn't forget Alina for 25 years, Ben, and I've realized that being forgotten isn't the tragedy. The tragedy is living a life that wasn't worth remembering." "Then you're a fool," the senator sighed and walked away. The night before the hearing was the darkest. A heavy storm rolled in off the coast, lashing the warehouse with rain. Arthur sat by a single lantern, reading the final pages of Alina's journal. Suddenly, the warehouse doors creaked open. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't the vultures. It was a group of people from the neighborhood. The old woman who had offered tools, a young Father Arthur had helped with a leak, and the leader of the gang, whose name Arthur had learned was Jax. "The word is out," Jax said, his voice low. "The trucks are coming tomorrow. They say they're going to board this place up and take you away." "I know, Jax," Arthur said. "I've done what I can, but the law is a different kind of beast. I don't know if I can stop them." The old woman stepped forward. "You gave us back our pride, Mr. Sterling. You didn't just give us bricks, you gave us a voice. We're not going to let them take the man who reminded us we exist." The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold, gray light. The steps of the courthouse were crowded with reporters and Sterling executives. Genevieve Vance stood at the top of the stairs, looking triumphant in a sharp, red suit. Arthur arrived in an old truck driven by Elias. As he stepped out, the cameras flashed, but the reporters were suddenly distracted by a sound coming from the surrounding streets. Hundreds of people were marching. They weren't carrying professional protest signs. They were carrying pieces of cardboard, old tools, and photographs of their families. They didn't shout slogans. They marched in a heavy, rhythmic silence that drowned out the noise of the city. At the front of the line was Jax and the vultures, standing side by side with the grandmothers and the laborers of the district. They formed a human wall around Arthur, a shield of flesh and bone that the police were hesitant to break. Arthur climbed the steps until he was standing level with Genevieve. "Look at them, Genevieve," Arthur said. "You wanted to prove I'm insane because I value these people more than your profit margins. But look at their faces. Do they look like the hallucinations of a crazy man, or do they look like the shareholders you forgot to count?" Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The board's lawyers presented their evidence: Arthur's erratic behavior, his unauthorized spending, and his obsession with a street hawker. Then Arthur was called to the stand. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern, "do you have anything to say in your defense? Why have you abandoned a multi-billion-dollar empire for a slum?" Arthur didn't look at the judge. He looked at the gallery, filled with the people from the district. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a final piece of evidence he had found in the back of Alina's journal, a document he hadn't seen before. "I didn't abandon an empire, Your Honor," Arthur said. "I found one. This is a deed of gift. It turns out that 25 years ago, when I sent Alina that money, she didn't just spend it on books. She bought the original parcels of land this warehouse sits on. She didn't buy them in her name. She bought them in mine." The courtroom gasped. "She knew I'd come back," Arthur's voice broke. "She knew that one day I'd be the man I promised to be. This land has been mine for 25 years. I didn't squander corporate assets to buy it. I used my own property. The board has no claim. The city has no claim. This is private land, and I've turned it into a permanent trust." Genevieve Vance turned white. The legal foundation of her coup crumbled in an instant. The judge ruled in Arthur's favor. The sanity hearing was dismissed, but Arthur knew the war wasn't over. The board would still try to remove him from the CEO position, and they would likely succeed. As Arthur walked out of the courthouse, the crowd erupted in a roar that shook the windows of the skyscrapers. He was a hero to the streets, but he was an outcast to the world he had spent his life building. He walked down the steps and found Elias waiting by the truck. "We won, sir," Elias said, a rare smile breaking across his face. "We protected the land, Elias," Arthur corrected him. "But I lost the company. By tomorrow, I'll be officially removed. I'll be broke. My reputation in the business world is dead." "So," Elias said, opening the truck door, "where to now, Mr. Sterling?" Arthur looked at the gold locket around his neck. He felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as an anchor. He looked at the tattered bag in the back of the truck, the one Samuel had left him. "We go back to work," Arthur said. "The roof on the south wing still leaks, and I have 500 kids who need a library. I think that's a fair trade for a skyscraper, don't you?" 5 years had passed since the day the Sterling Empire had fractured. To the world of Wall Street, Arthur Sterling was a cautionary tale, a man who had reached the sun and then inexplicably decided to burn his wings. His name was no longer spoken in the boardrooms of power, except as a whisper of madness. The building that once bore his name had been rebranded, the sterling letters stripped away and replaced by a cold, corporate logo. But 3 miles away, in the heart of the old district, the name Arthur was spoken with a reverence usually reserved for saints or old kings. The district was unrecognizable. It wasn't a gentrified playground for the rich, Nor was it the decaying slum it had once been. It was a living neighborhood. The warehouses had been converted into bright, airy lofts with rent-controlled caps. The streets were lined with trees, and the air smelled not of exhaust and despair, but of lavender and fresh bread. At the center of it all stood the Alina Memorial Library. It wasn't a cold, marble building. It was built of warm brick and recycled wood, with floor-to-ceiling windows that invited the sunlight in. Inside the library, a man sat at a simple wooden desk. He wore a worn flannel shirt and denim trousers. His hands were calloused, and his hair was entirely white now, but he looked younger than he had in the penthouse. Arthur Sterling was no longer a CEO. He was the head of the trust. He lived in a small apartment above the library. He didn't own a Rolls-Royce. He walked to work, stopping to talk to the shopkeepers and the children who ran past him. "Arthur, the shipment of new books just arrived," a voice called out. It was Jack's. The former gang leader was now the head of the district's maintenance and security collective. He had traded his hoodie for a uniform of a different kind, one of community service. "Put them in the history section, Jack's," Arthur smiled. "Let the kids know where they came from." Arthur walked to the window. He looked out at the courtyard where a bronze statue stood. It wasn't a statue of himself or even of Alina. It was a statue of a simple wooden cart with a bag resting on the seat. It was a monument to honesty. Despite the peace he had found, one question had haunted Arthur for 5 years. Who was Samuel? He had searched every record, every census, and every old photo of the town where Alina had lived. He found no mention of a Samuel who had lived near her. He found no neighbor who matched the description. It was as if the man had stepped out of the shadows and back into them. One rainy afternoon, a courier arrived at the library. He handed Arthur a small, dusty package wrapped in brown paper. There was no return address, only a familiar scent, lavender. Arthur's heart hammered as he unwrapped it. Inside was a small, handwritten letter and an old, silver-framed mirror. "Dear Arthur," the letter began, "the work you have done is beautiful. You have finally filled the bag with things that have weight. People ask who I am. They ask how I knew Alina. The truth, Arthur, is that I never met her, not in the way you think." Arthur paused, his breath hitching. 25 years ago, I was a young man working in the post office of that small town. I saw your letters. I saw the gold locket. And I saw the letter of rejection you sent. I saw Alina's face when she read it. I saw her heart break, and I saw her decide to be better than the man who left her. I wasn't her neighbor. I was the man who watched her from a distance, inspired by her grace. I promised myself that if I ever became rich or powerful, I wouldn't be like you. But life is funny, Arthur. I became a successful man, and I realized I was becoming exactly like you, cold, hard, and empty. Arthur looked at the mirror in the package. I lost everything in a crash 10 years ago. I became a hawker by necessity, and in that poverty I found the honesty you were missing. I didn't find the locket in a trash can. Alina gave it to me on her deathbed when I volunteered at the hospice. She told me, "One day, a man will come looking for his soul. Give him this." I wasn't your judge, Arthur. I was your mirror. I was the version of you that had already lost everything so that you wouldn't have to lose your soul. The letter was signed, Samuel. Arthur looked into the silver-framed mirror Samuel had sent. He didn't see the king of the concrete jungle. He didn't see a broken CEO. He saw a man who had finally earned the right to look himself in the eye. He realized that Samuel was the black story, the shadow side of success that reminds us what truly matters. We all carry a bag. Sometimes it's full of gold that weighs nothing, and sometimes it's full of junk that weighs the world. Arthur walked out of his office and into the main hall of the library. A young boy was sitting on a rug, struggling to read a book. Arthur knelt down beside him. "Need some help with that word?" Arthur asked. "It's too hard," the boy whispered. "Nothing is too hard if you have the right light to see it by," Arthur said, pointing to the sun streaming through the windows. As the sun set, the lights of the Sterling Empire building flickered on in the distance. To the rest of the world, that building was the center of the universe. But to Arthur, it was just a silhouette against a much brighter sky. He had mocked a poor man for his honesty, and in return, that man had given him a life worth living. The bag was no longer a secret, it was a foundation. And as Arthur looked at the thriving community around him, he knew that while he had opened the bag and gone silent, the silence was no longer one of shock. It was a silence of peace. In a world that tells you wealth is everything, remember that the heaviest things we carry are the promises we break. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more BlackSide stories that challenge the way you see the world. Leave a comment below. What would someone find if they opened your bag today? Is it full of gold or is it full of honesty? Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to change their story. Remember, the weight of an honest life is the only thing you can take with you when the towers fall.